I am Charity Chandler Cole, the CEO of CASA LA. At CASA LA, we organize the community to show up in life and in court to advocate for children and families in LA County's overburdened child welfare and juvenile justice systems. Through an intentional, restorative, and culturally responsive lens, we train a village of committed, consistent, and caring adults who provide equitable, life-affirming connections. Our vision is a Los Angeles County in which all children and families have equitable access to the resources and support they need to be whole and thrive. Our mission and vision cannot be accomplished until our children live in a world that is equitable and just. That's why we are committed to doing our part to address racial injustice in the child welfare and juvenile justice systems, and using this platform, our Fireside chats, to bring communities and various stakeholders together to have real conversations about what's happening in the world of child welfare in LA County, with the hope of building awareness, informing our communities, activating a safe space for all, and strengthening our ability to advocate for our youth. Today, I have the privilege and honor of introducing you to a phenomenal group of people, all of whom are dedicated to transforming the lives of our youth and families in LA counties and beyond. Our guests today include CASA LA board member Christian Green, who is also a professor, a foster youth advocate, a civil rights leader, and author, sociologist and CEO working to bring awareness surrounding foster youth advocacy, homelessness, and many more societal issues concerning diversity and inclusion. We have Angela Quijada Banks, who is an NAACP Image Award nominated American author of the best-selling book, and you know, girl, I bought tons of your copies when they came out, the Black Foster Youth Handbook, 50 plus lessons I learned to successfully age out of foster care and holistically heal. She is also the founder of Soulful Liberation, which started as a podcast to support young people with trauma navigate their healing journey through the pandemic, and has expanded into a movement to liberate oneself and community. And Heather Wilson, an attorney with the Children's Law Center of California and a member of the Eliminating Racial Disparity and Disproportionality Community Advisory Committee with LA County Department of Children and Family Services. Thank you all so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us, and welcome to our Fireside Chat. For our audience, we will take a few questions towards the end if time permits, so please submit a question if you have one in the Q&A. So let's get right into it. Racial disparities occur at nearly every major decision-making point along the child welfare continuum. At the national level, African-American families are overrepresented in reports of suspected maltreatment and are subjected to Child Protective Services investigations at higher rates than other families. In addition, African-American and American Indian or Alaska Native children are at a greater risk than other children of being confirmed for maltreatment and placed in out-of-home care. Families of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds also experience disparate treatment once they are involved in the child welfare system. Relative to other children, African-American children spend more time in foster care and are less likely to reunify with their families. And compared with white children, they are less likely to receive services. In addition, African-American and American Indian or Alaska Native children are more likely than other children to be removed from their homes and to experience a termination of parental rights. In 2019, American Indian and Alaska Native children made up 1% of the child welfare population, but accounted for 2% of the foster care population, while African American children accounted for roughly 14% of the child population and 23% of the foster care population. That same year, white children made up half of the child population and just 44% of the foster care population. And although Hispanic children have historically been underrepresented in foster care at the national level, we are now seeing them being overrepresented in 20 states from the most recent available data received in 2018. Children of color are overrepresented in the child welfare system, and Black children have been most significantly impacted by the racial disproportionality. Racial disproportionality in child welfare exists because of influences that are both external to child welfare systems and part of the child welfare system. We can argue that there are internal and external causes of disproportionate involvement that originate from a common underlying factor: structural and institutional racism that is both within child welfare systems and part of society at large. For my panelists today, let's just start this conversation, mind you, very informal conversation of colleagues off with what are your thoughts, feelings, and understanding of the racial makeup of the child welfare system in LA County and beyond. And anyone can jump in and answer.
Okay, I will go ahead. Really, to me, it's extremely alarming that it's 2022 and within the American child welfare system, it's still not prioritizing sustainable outcomes for our communities. I believe that many times when we are addressing this issue or even talking about this issue, it's important that people with lived experience are at the table, because then we can really get lost into like numbers and statistical data and other things and forgetting that there are real humans behind, behind all those numbers. I am African and Indigenous, which now is recognized as Mexican in this at this time. And so thinking about the Black and Latino overwhelming disproportionality, I represent that. I've been that, and as well as my family. And so it's disgusting and it's alarming to see that this is still a conversation, and the humanity of that these are grandparents, these are grandmothers, these are mothers, fathers, sons, daughters that are being affected, I think gets lost.
Thank you for that, Angela. Anyone else want to share their thoughts on just the data they heard? Like, how does that make you feel? Just hearing those data and statistics. And mind you, Charity Chandler Cole did not make up any of that. The research, the data is out there. So these are real numbers that have historically existed.
Absolutely. Okay. You want to go, Heather? Because I'm trying to, I'll chime in, but go ahead, Heather. I'll go after you.
Okay, great. Not a problem. I totally agree with what Angelica said. And, as someone who works in the courtroom every day, I can attest that is indeed true. I can always, look at the zip code. It's always the same zip codes. If you know anything about LA County and you know it well, it's rare that you see cases coming in from Calabasas, from Woodland Hills, from Tarzana, from Newport Beach, from Dana Point. It's just really rare, but I do see a lot all the time that come in from the Vermont corridor, South LA, East LA, Pacoima, Reseda, Winnetka. I mean, these are just common, and Watts. So you don't see them from South Pasadena, you don't see them from San Marino, and yet still, you would be led to believe that there is no abuse that goes on. There's no DV, there's no drug abuse or substance abuse issues in white families or where these communities are, and that's simply not the case. I myself, like Angelica, like many of you here, were also touched by the system twice. My brother was removed from the home. I was removed from my bio family as a baby. So, and we are kids of color. We're Black kids, biracial kids. And so they also make a disproportionate number of kids in the system. I think it goes back to the tropes and stereotypes that are so normalized in our society and that are even accepted maybe unconsciously by Black people themselves. We have the doll experiment where Black kids, when asked between a white doll and a Black doll, which is the prettier one, which is the good one, they referred to the white doll. Why? Because they, like all of us, are in a society that unconsciously and consciously has a norm where people who look a certain way are deemed better, smarter, brighter than those who look more like them. And I do believe, just like the lady, the professor who was in the piece earlier, I think a lot of it does date back to slavery. That was 400 years, not a few decades. That was 400 years of systematic separation of Black families, of mindsets and perspectives that created about who makes the rules, who needs to follow them, the capabilities of Black people and Black bodies. And that doesn't just go away after the Civil War, that continues. And so it really is a mindset. I have hope that with discussions like this and the work that we are doing as individuals and through our organizations, that it's going to change. But we can't sit here and not say that all of that has not affected what we see in child welfare. I do believe it is just a continuation of what we sadly started off in this country with slavery, Jim Crow, and segregation. We continue to see that assault on families of color today for the good intentions often of trying to help these poor children out of poverty and with less educated, more violent parents. Those again are just tropes and stereotypes that still live on.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Heather. Christian.
Yeah, absolutely. Heather, you hit it right on the nail in regards to structural and institutional racism. Charity talked about it as well. My thoughts and feelings and understanding of the racial makeup is that there are too many Black youth, Black kids that are in the system, right? And so you talked about Pacoima, you talked about Watts and stuff, but I'm out here in the Antelope Valley, and I don't think people know that like 70% of all of our foster youth are out here, right? In the Antelope Valley, and I'm here to speak about that today. And it comprises of a huge amount. So looking at the disproportionality, it's all across the land, you know, in LA County, in other states, and across America in general. And so these conversations are so critical because, you know, our kids are being left behind. People are getting money, they're getting all these different resources, but our foster youth are not. And so we have to look at the humanity, kind of like what Angela said. I'm a former foster youth. I think all of us are, right? And so this is so cool for us to center our lived experiences today. And I'll shut up. Okay.
No, I love that. And you pointed out something, you know, as we talk about stereotypes, really interesting about our communities too, is because we all, as professional, successful Black people, people of color, you know, do not identify with the stereotypes that are, you know, out there about us, about our communities, about how we parent. So let's go into what some of those, and I know Heather touched on it briefly, but what are some of the stereotypes about Blacks and even poor families that we have been conditioned to believe? Why is this problematic, and how does this contribute to the racial disproportionality and disparity we see? What's so different about Black and brown parents?
So I'll chime in on this one first, and then Heather, I see you unmuted yourself. So for me, it's like, you know, media plays a huge role, books play a huge role. I mean, structural, institutional, again, we could talk about that. But when we look at like how Black families have been viewed as broken and dysfunctional, when in actuality, Black family is really healing and we're becoming adaptive. You know, there are 3 flaws that I was reading in an article, and they were talking about how like the first flaw is that many people try to fit the Black family unit into the white family unit, right? Despite their clear historical differences. The second flaw is that this belief in this idea that the Black family was destroyed during enslavement. That's not so. The last flaw was being that the durability and adaptability, of the Black family is always overlooked. And so what we want to make sure that we try to do is counteract those stereotypes and those myths. And that's what we're doing today.
Right. Absolutely. Heather, did you want to add? Because I got something to add to that too. Did you have something to add?
Sure. I'm just want to, I think Christian hit the nail on the head, and just remind, I think there's a sense that if you're Black and brown and you're automatically just poor. And I think there's again a mindset in our society that poor people, that there's a need to save kids from poor families, right? That they can't possibly give them a safe environment. You know, we see it in our RFA and our space waivers, and these sort of middle class ideas of what is needed to keep kids safe. You know, kids can't share a bed, kids can't share a room. And we know that many Black and brown families live intergenerationally. Many Black and brown families may or may not live in a 3, 4, 5 bedroom house, and each child has their own room. And yet many of the bureaucratic permits that are needed in order to get funding to have children, relatives, have relative placement require such things. So we do need to look at that, and that does need to be changed and understood, that just because it doesn't fit maybe a middle class Anglo archetype, it doesn't mean that it's unsafe for children. I want to just, you know, have people think about, if you look at the whole world, there are many, many children that would live, quote unquote, in poverty according to the American standard, and yet they have their family with them, they're loved, and they're safe, and they may live in a 1-room hut, building, apartment, but they are safe and loved. And that is what we really need to be focusing on, not so much whether or not these people make a certain amount or have enough bedrooms in their house.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hella, I saw you on mic, so I'll let you go before I comment on this one.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on what our colleagues are already talking about. And specifically that the Black families are not equipped to care for their children, and an entity such as the American Child Welfare System is. I think about my personal experience as a Black and Indigenous person who was also experiencing poverty with my family at various points in my life. And at the moment when I was 16, tired, in a lot of pain, really feeling like the world was on my shoulders, and given two choices: either to stay in a one-bedroom hotel with my family who was under incredible amounts of stress that resulted in, physical, emotional harm, neglect, or to go to this fantasy described place where all my and my siblings' problems would be alleviated. And I chose to go into the system. And given the choice again, I would choose it again. However, this brings me to how this is problematic. White supremacy culture really breeds the notion of this or that thinking. So to go into foster care or stay where I was, not mentally wanting to continue in my human experience, of course I would choose the latter. But if instead I was given the option to, and my family, to enroll into a community-centered family well-being program as a family to help us learn about financial literacy, mental health services, have clothes for myself and my siblings, support with my driver's license. I was 16. And a true community wraparound support system, I believe myself and probably 9 out of 10 youth would choose to have a wraparound support to heal and to learn how to live sustainably with their family. So, it really isn't just about the save the child, but really save the family.
Thank you, Angela, for saying all of that. And what you mentioned is so important. I actually feel compelled to just drop some knowledge right now, because Black and brown children weren't always a part of the child welfare system. And it was actually very okay for us to live any type of way when we were, neglecting and abandoning our children to breastfeed and care for other people's children during slavery. And when there weren't benefits and services to support us, no one questioned it. It was okay. And pre-World War II, foster care orphanages were dominated by wealthy private organizations and religious charities, and Black families were discriminated against it in the form of non-inclusion. Welfare services were openly segregated, and even after World War II, when these institutions started to rescue destitute immigrant children, they refused to accept Black children. Granted, there were a few orphanages or asylums that accepted Black children only, but they were extremely inferior and overcrowded as compared to the other services offered and made available to non-Black children. In addition, Black children were looked down upon and considered delinquent if they were homeless or seen running the streets. So instead of offering child welfare services and support, the institution they were referred to was prison. Because of the various tactics and blatant racism used to exclude Black and minority families, one being religion, Black families relied heavily on each other for support. Same with brown families. And our community networks, such as extended family, churches, or various women groups in the event of death of a parent, imprisonment, illness, or even abandonment. Granted, minority families had a hard time supporting themselves, let alone any additional mouths, which created an added burden. However, there was a collective responsibility to support and be there for one another. The child welfare system finally started to acknowledge Black children and brown children and families when services shifted from private to public agencies. Understand this. When private institutions still existed and still practiced blatant racism in their missions, states now had a financial incentive to provide services to poor people through a series of legislation, but most notably for me, initiatives that were introduced through Lyndon B. Johnson when we were addressing poverty and unemployment under his framework, to name a few. If you recall, there was a whole war on poverty, where programs rolled out such as Medicaid, child nutrition programs, SNAP, Head Start, Title I, education, job corps. There's so many to name. And keep in mind that also that a lot of these benefits were manifestation of the civil rights movement, which made the welfare system available to Black people. We fought to have access to these services that were once that we were once previously excluded from through the New Deal welfare programs by restrictive state eligibility requirements. An example of this would be the 1935 Aid for Dependent Children Act, which prevented the removal of children from their homes for financial reasons, which is a really good one, but it was only primarily given to white mothers. In Dorothy Roberts' books, and that's the researcher earlier, Heather, that was referenced in the video, and I do have her book too. They mentioned Torn Apart, but Shattered Bonds. If you really care about this topic, Dorothy Roberts' book, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, you see how raggedy it is because I stay reading this book. But in her book, Shattered Bonds, she talks about how once welfare became increasingly associated with Black mothers, it became increasingly burdened with behavior modification rules, work requirements, and reduced effective benefits levels. Black mothers were now stigmatized as lazy, and the image of the welfare mother changed from the worthy white widow to an immoral Black welfare queen. With this came over surveillance of minority communities and the policing of Black mothers via welfare programs, and now overrepresentation of Black children in the child welfare system. And if you looked hard enough, you would actually see the uncanny resemblance of the child welfare system to mass incarceration. And so when we look at the stereotypes that exist, people have long, for decades, for centuries, looked down upon us as inadequate, not worthy of. But it was okay for us to run the streets, find excuses to put us in prison so that we can now have free labor again. But the second when it benefited us, we were able to over surveil, and it's tied to a dollar. Now we have all these systems and programs in place that continuously still to this day do not benefit us. I just wanted to drop a little bit of that history. Maybe we'll do a fireside chat one day where we really just focus on the history, because there's so much folks don't know about why this exists and how intentional a lot of this is, because it's very, very profitable. So any comments on that? I'll go to the next question.
No, you're right on target. You know, I got to say something. You're right on target, Charity, because we cannot talk about the child welfare system without talking about the criminal justice system and how they intersect at the middle, right? And so we have, like you're saying, it's profit, it's a capitalist society. You look at white supremacy, these tools, these mechanisms, and it's so grateful for you pulling in the historical lesson, because a lot of us just don't know, you know, like all those acts that you just listed, all these things that you just talked about, like, this is so, I think you should do a whole nother fireside chat on that, because the historical implications, it's so necessary for us to have these conversations. And then upon those conversations, what do we do to act? It should not replicate what we've already done.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And with that, in order to really funnel in all of these Black and brown families and have the overrepresentation we see, there's this thing called mandated reporting that heavily contributes to racial disproportionality and the disparity we see. Would anyone like to comment on, you know, mandated reporting, what they feel, what they see, what needs to be changed? For me, this is one of the biggest drivers of children into the child welfare system. Would anyone want to comment on mandated reporting?
Well, for me personally, and I think I agree with you 100%, that there needs to be a change in mandated reporting laws. And it's something I know that Children's Law Center with our legislative committee is really, really looking at. I find that it's been overused, abused, and unfortunately, it's really hurt families more than help. Again, I always say, as we know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And so often these laws are put in place with the idea of saving families, but they are, of course, again, we have these mindsets, oftentimes unconscious and conscious, where the people we want to save are usually people who we feel need the help. And I think too often, because of racism, because of bias and prejudice, we often think that that is Black and brown children. And so in our communities, we have mandated reporters who I think automatically, just when you walk in the room and you look the way you look, think this child's in danger because of their parents. Whereas if the parent is white, they usually give them the benefit of the doubt. There'll maybe a discussion, they'll pull from other resources, organizations to try to work it out, or they really won't even question anything. So I think that racism plays a huge role in who gets reported on and who doesn't. Also, even within our own communities of color, we do tend to sometimes call on us. They may not be mandated reporters. They may just be a concerned friend A lot of people call the referral service for many reasons. Sometimes they have genuine concern. Sometimes they just don't like you and they're just going to make your life heck, and call on you. I think also even that can relate back to Black people. I'm talking about specifically Black people who were descendants of slaves, because as we know, during the slave time, you were rewarded when you were Black and you were talking about other Black people, reporting them to the master, when you could gain favor with the master. I mean, I know all this seems like it was a long time ago, but the mindsets are still there. And I think we can't be dishonest and say that happened so long ago, it doesn't exist. It does exist. It's in the way we treat each other in our communities. It's a way we may distrust each other in our communities. And so often, due to segregation and our own teaching in society as Black people, we're kind of taught that if it's white, it must be better. And if it's Black, it may not be better. And so I think there's twofold. One, we have over-reporting with mandated reporting because of racism and stereotypes of just Black people in general. And two, even within our own community, there's a sense of something is wrong with us, and I need to call the system that has been set up to save people like us from ourselves. And so I think that's a mindset also that we need to work on as a community, and I'm hoping will change.
Yeah, and go ahead, Christian.
Yeah, definitely. I spoke to a few folks out here with our ERDD team. Shout out to Apple Valley. And I want to talk about the how and the who. How this mandated reporting contributes to racial disproportionality and disparity is that it serves as a tool of white supremacy. It's violent, it's not culturally competent, and it does not serve the community in totality. Now, I also want to address the who, because there was a conversation amongst myself and a colleague, and how they were saying how school police are one of the highest mandated reporters as well as teachers. I don't know about y'all, but that blows my mind. Like, okay, that goes and speaks back to the level of empathy that is needed in these schools. And someone said it in the chat about educational system. The educational system is jacked up too, because we have these teachers that don't know how to create a relationship with these students. So then now, student comes looking a little different, may not have the best clothing on, and it's a fault of the parent all of a sudden. That is a problem. Instead of reaching out and trying to find resources for these parents and find resources for these kids, you want to send them, arrest them and ask later. That's unacceptable. And I think that it needs to be done away with.
Yeah, and check this out, because everything you and Heather and Christian said are so true. So for those who aren't aware, mandated reporting is a requirement that if you interact with children, whether you are a social worker, a teacher, a healthcare professional, law enforcement, a CASA volunteer, anyone, if you interact with children, you are required by law to report anything that's suspicion. You don't have to investigate it. You don't have to ask follow-up questions. You just have to suspect that something is going on, something is not right, and you have to report it. And so when you combine this requirement to mandate report, to do mandated reporting, which also is tied to, it says if you don't report, whether you're right or wrong, if you don't report, you can lose your license, you can go to jail, you can face criminal charges. There's this fear to also report, coupled with implicit bias and racism and the stereotypes that exist on one end, and on the back end, there's a protection that if you're wrong, if you got it wrong, and if people were called out to their houses and social workers and law enforcement showed up and removed your children, you had to go through this whole traumatic experience that ended up not being substantiated, it's fine because you have immunity, you're protected. So you have these two things playing. And so you have folks who are literally scared to, forced to, on top of being conditioned to report our Black and brown families that we have, as a result, overrepresentation in the child welfare system. So if we see a Black kid who may come to school because they have mismatched socks, or a brown kid, it could be because one, their family can't afford socks. Two, maybe it got eaten up in the laundry and we didn't have time this morning to really, find that pair, but put the socks on and let's go to school. But because we've been conditioned to look at our children as less than, as being neglected, as being abused, we have this system of just over reporting children. And now we have a hotline that's overworked with calls that, I want to say, and correct me, I know we have DCFS folks on here, and I've been in cahoots with the hotline. I want to say less than 15%, 10% actually get substantiated. So look at the number of families that are being traumatized, being torn apart, losing trust in their schools and their healthcare professionals and law enforcement, and are being torn apart as a result of mandated reporting. And this system continuously funnels Black and brown children into the so-called child welfare system. And so we have to, look at mandated reporting, and it's not just personal racism or bias, it's literally institutional racism that is occurring. And so that's, one of the many ways in which our systems have kind of cultivated, and, come into kind of play a role with our individual racism, colluded with our individual racism in a way where we're kind of like literally working, against our own communities, in support of this requirement that we have to kind of submit to, which is kind of crazy to me. I want to kind of move this along to, Dorothy Roberts also, as we talk about mandated reporting and we look at the stereotypes that exist and all of the ways in which our systems are just infiltrated with white supremacy culture, with racism, with this attack literally on Black and brown families and what it means to even exist in our skin and parent the way we do. Dorothy Roberts calls it our child welfare system, in the way that it exists, an assault on family preservation. Do you feel that our system in the way it exists is an assault on family preservation or destroying of Black families? And how so, if you feel it is, and why not if you don't think that it isn't? Like, do we feel this is something that's happening on purpose, intentionally? Is it beyond our control? Is it rooted in our policies and practices? I'll start off by answering, I think it is. I think our child welfare system, in the way that exists, and mind you, this is not an attack in any way on individuals that work in the child welfare system. I mean, we can get into that later, but we have a system that literally has been designed, in my opinion, to tear apart Black and brown families. And then when we see this happening and we see the disproportionality and disparity that exists, we have to ask ourselves why. And then when we get into asking ourselves why, is it racism? Is racism the cause? Is it because it's so profitable to continue to warehouse Black and brown children into the system? Are we trying to maintain that Black and brown people are inferior and should be subjected to over surveillance and rules and regulations and laws? I mean, what is it? What is it?
So I think that it's really time to start accepting the fact that the history and culture of white supremacy is unbelievably and insidiously a part of every facet of our existence, including, yes, foster care, the adoption process, the entire billion-dollar industry that is the child welfare system. So how, for me, when I'm hearing these questions, and I'm in this space often, and it's to me, it's why is this still a question for a lot of people? Why is it still a question of whether or not this is racism? Yes, it is racism. And I've come to find in my research, and I'm sure my colleagues as well, lived expertise, that, thousands of youth and families and other constituents in the child welfare system across the states and other countries, one of the biggest reasons why it's been over 160 years, some context, 1853, Charles Loring Brace founded what we now know as the child welfare system. So over 160 years since the foster care system, and still having these issues, is because we are not on the same page. We're not on the same page on what the issue is. Mm-hmm. And so if we keep on saying it's this issue, it could be that, it could be this, it could be that, we're not getting to the issue. And, when we don't have a clear diagnosis, and, I'll use an example of cancer, and we should think of racism and white supremacy as a cancer. We have a general understanding that we must move quickly. If we have a general diagnosis, okay, we know that this is what it is, we can move quickly and effectively towards solutions. Mm-hmm. We define the cause or the root of it, and we create strategies and move forward and do that. But because we are all, different organizations, different folks on different accords, mm-hmm. Then how are we really going to dismantle this and have clear solutions? White supremacy breeds this racial culture that is outside of the focus of working together as human beings and seeing the value of each human being. and all of our complex experiences, and we shouldn't have to forego our ethnic backgrounds or the way that we identify and sacrifice what actually happened in history, right? And how it's actually pervasively showing up in our world today.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I think it's important. Oftentimes we have discussions about racism or racial disproportionality and disparity, and then we don't always really define for folks what that means. And so I want to take another moment, if you'll let me, because I'm not going to drop as long a history, but I do want to define racism, because I know we have a lot of people in the chat and in the group who are like, who want to be supportive, want to help, but really being able to identify what that looks like at a structural individual level. And then afterwards, I want us to break down, how do we reckon with this? How do we address it? What do we need to do internally to be anti-racist? That's where I want to go after this next comment I'm going to make, so that we can really help folks that are watching and a part of this to, move forward in their daily lives, to contribute to making our child welfare system anti-racist and really addressing the issues. So our child welfare system, there's really has a lot of structural and even individual racism. Some of it could be implicit, internal. We don't know it's occurring, but structural racism is a system in which our policies, our institutional practices, our cultural representations and other norms kind of work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. It is primarily characterized by white supremacy, as Angela mentioned, which is the preferential treatment, privilege, power, access, and opportunities for white people at the expense of cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. It encompasses the entire system of white supremacy, diffused and infused in all aspects of society, including our laws, our history, culture, politics, economics, and our entire social fabric. It is the most profound and pervasive form of racism. All other forms of racism, because there are many, such as individual, interpersonal, internalized, etc., emerges from structural racism. Individual racism, the part that kind of colludes with structural racism as we do what we're told in our jobs, but then the individual part kind of comes up. It's referring to our assumptions, our beliefs, our behaviors. And it is a form of racial discrimination that stems from conscious and unconscious prejudice. It includes examples such as, telling a racist joke, believing in the inherent superiority of white people over other racial groups. It could be not hiring a person of color because something just doesn't feel right. And it is connected to and learned from broader socioeconomic histories and processes, and is supported and reinforced by structural racism. Our United States cultural narrative about racism typically focuses on individual racism and fails to recognize structural racism. And it's often even seen as a psychological bias that can be cured, by all these implicit bias trainings. So let's focus on, individual racism. But there are so many different forms of racism at play, and our child welfare system is riddled with structural racism and perpetuated through individual racism by caseworkers, social workers, judges, doctors, teachers, school administrators, and a host of others that have the power over deciding the outcomes of our children and families. When I entered the system at 16 years old, it was after I was arrested and incarcerated for stealing a pack of underwear. As a minor, I was not asked once why I stole the underwear, what the conditions were in my family that caused me to steal them, what services I needed to prevent me from stealing in the future. No one knew or cared that I was poor and often stole food and clothing from my siblings and I to survive. With no record and a history of being a straight A student, your girl was smart, okay? I was criminalized, handcuffed, and punished. No one cared to notice that my mother was suffering from an undiagnosed mental health issue, or that she couldn't come pick me up because she would risk losing her job that she needed to continue supporting not only her family, but to keep her Section 8 housing. My parents divorced when I was 10, and we were struggling so much that we did what we needed to survive. Because of structural racism that existed via policies, assessment tools, and discriminatory policies that valued output over outcomes, my experience was nothing more than the collateral consequence of what happens to poor people and their children. Foster youth, for the most part in general, are the failed attempts by the government to control minorities through welfare programs that should be meant to help and restore, but instead hurt, surveil, and punish. They are the children left behind by the incarcerated fathers and mothers that are so devastated by not having their support system, their rock oftentimes, their partner to help them. and being left with the burden of raising their children alone, that they often turn to substances to cope with their depression and constant feelings of defeat, as one example. There are so many. Had my race not been considered, I wonder, would I have been arrested if I was a white girl on 3rd and Fairfax in that area? Probably not. Would I have been steered towards resources to divert my actions to survive? I probably would have been driven home, since my mother couldn't pick me up and stop to get McDonald's on the way, because they wanted to make sure I was fed and taken care of on the way home. If the money that was spent on incarcerating and housing me in foster care was used to help feed and clothe my family and provide a sustainable solution, let's say at the bare minimum, an actual living wage for my mother, would I have been avoided? I probably would have avoided all of the abuse and trauma I experienced in the system. What instead resulted for my mother and so many other families is being over-surveilled and forced into parenting in other classes that not only not address the reasons for why our children are in the system, but causes them to miss work, miss jobs, miss out on educational opportunities. You know, the claim was that I was being protected. I wasn't. My welfare wasn't actually taken into consideration, nor were the needs of my families. And I just want to drop that because I think it's so important that as we look at racism, as we look at, you know, disparities and disproportionality in our systems, like it's, and you know, you said it, Angela, earlier, like, yeah, we have all the data, but we're real human beings. We are real life people having these experiences and struggling through this. So, you know, we only have about 10 minutes left. You know, what does or should an anti-racist child welfare system look like? Like in its policies, practices, data collection, assessment, so on. What should it look like?
I'll just start off. So many changes. I'm happy that the reason for my hope is that we're having these conversations and things I think are beginning finally to change. I think Angelica makes a great point. Yes, it is racism. It is our unconscious and conscious biases that do play a role in this. I really don't think there's another answer or diagnosis. So the question is, what do we do moving forward, which is a great question. And I think it has to be attacked in multiple facets. One way is that we're discussing, I know with DCFS, CLC and DCFS are discussing the blind removal project, where when they get a warrant removal request, they don't have the name of the children or the person, they don't have the address or the zip code. They merely have, why is this possibly going to be approved for a warrant to remove these kids? Like, what are the facts? So that way there's no sense of, oh, when you see remember I mentioned earlier, you look at the city, if you see a Pacoima, a Watts, East LA, instantly, whether we like to think so or not, people's red flags are up. Whereas if we saw, which we rarely do, a South Pasadena or San Marino, if we see a Lancaster or Palmdale, the flag goes up. So they're saying we need to stop that. We just want the facts. That's one way we can combat that. And in fact, in New York State, in upstate New York, they have done that, a blind removal project. There was an overrepresentation of Black children. When they did the blind removal project, there was a significant decrease of Black children removed from their home. And so we're working to get that changed here. Also here, working with training, yes, multiple training, not just as a group, but also people internally, right? It's not so much about changing other people. We first have to look in the mirror and change ourselves. That means me, Heather, that means all of us. You have to look in the mirror and say, what are my biases? What are my prejudices? Even though I'm a Black person, yes, I have biases and prejudices too. So first and foremost, we've got to look in the mirror and change ourselves and change how we see other human beings and change our perspective and realize we are human and all of us have the same feelings. We love our children, we love our families, we want to be heard, we want to be respected, we want to be safe. And so these are things that I think are going to have to happen simultaneously. And so it's not just one answer, it's many answers. I think the blind removal project is one, training is another, also looking at yourselves in the mirror and saying, where do I need to change? You know, as an attorney who works and represents children, maybe you all feel the same way. It is sometimes very difficult. And my heart really goes out to specifically people of color who are social workers working for DCFS. I sometimes feel like, am I part of the problem? You know, when I'm sitting there, if I'm joining with the department's recommendation to separate a child from their family, am I part of the problem? What can I do as an attorney to try to keep this family together? Who do I need to talk to? What resources can I find? Can I connect this family with a CASA? So I think it's a responsibility of us as individuals to really, really reach out and make the effort to see what we can do to make a difference and not just practice the status quo. That's something we're going to have to take the responsibility of as individuals and also as an organization.
Oh my gosh, Heather, I don't know if you noticed, but my eyes watered when you said that, because that's something I talk about all the time, like how we show up in our individual capacities. It doesn't matter where you work. We get to show up and decide we're going to follow these raggedy ass policies that we don't agree with, or are we going to show up for our communities? I got asked the other day at our ERDD meeting, actually, Heather, I don't know if you were there, like you say, you're an abolitionist. You constantly talk about how, much you do not like our child welfare system. How do you work so well with certain people at DCFS? Because I find my people, doesn't mean you black, brown, or it could be any color. I find people who are not just allies, not just showing up to do a job, but that are co-conspirators in healing and restoring our communities. There are so many phenomenal, dynamic people working at DCFS that are working to help our families. I could name them off the top, but I'm gonna miss some, and they're gonna be texting me. There are so many phenomenal people that work at DCFS that are, in cahoots with helping our families, restoring them, challenging a lot of the things they have to do really that are not for our communities, looking at how do we keep families together? How do we strengthen them? So how we show up individually, I don't care what your job description says, if it is not supporting our young people, if it's not supporting our communities, if you would want someone to show up differently had you been in that situation, then you need to check yourself. And if you're not in a position of authority, it's okay, because there's still so many opportunities for us to show up individually in these spaces, and get in cahoots with people at other organizations to say, how are we today? Even CLC Lato, how do we come together and say, what's happening with this child? You have all the information on the mom and the dad, the parents. I have the information on the children. Sure could get over here. What's the whole picture? That's what I love about CASA. We get to talk to everyone. We get to get all the information, and we come together and figure out what's in the best interest of this family, not just this parent or just this child or us as a county. What's in the best interest of this family to make them whole? But we're taught to be siloed, to work separately, to do our thing over here, you do it over there, work against each other. Wow. When I'm in these hearings, I'm like, why are we not talking to each other? Why are we not on the same page? Why are we fighting? Why are we making shit up? Let's be honest. I mean, some of these meetings, like, what? Are you trying to trick? Was that a trick? It is not okay. And so we have to show up individually and say, this is how I'm going to show up in this job, in this role, in support of my communities. And if that's not what you're doing, then we're going to call you out and you're going to be held accountable and you don't need to be there. So my answer for how do you be anti-racist in these organizations is, one, they shouldn't exist. But if they do, we need to challenge and question anything that is in opposition of restoring and healing our communities, period. That policy, that process, that assessment, that checkbox, why is this here? What does this mean? What is it doing? Christian.
Exactly. No, you're right on it. You're on a roll, Charity. I don't even want to say anything. You're
I'm
right.
sorry. This topic is so I'm taking over. I apologize.
And that's why you're the CEO. So we love it. And so you're right on point about us understanding, just understanding how to show up. I think I've been saying that more since I've been hearing you say it. People are scared to show up. Mm-hmm. Educators are scared to show up. The DCFS workers are sometimes scared because, we become accustomed to getting a paycheck. We have to get that out of our mindset that it's about just a paycheck. You know what I'm saying? Like, be okay with getting fired. It's okay. You will get hired somewhere else. I'm not saying do that right now, but you have to be able to speak up. I just want to add my little 2 cents about the anti-racist child welfare system. Mm-hmm. Is that one, I imagine this one without police. So I don't want no police in our educational systems. I don't want no police dealing with our child welfare system. They are not our heroes. They are not our mentors. They are not there to protect us as they are supposed to. So I just want to add my 2 cents for that, because we need to be about prevention first. We need to be thinking about understanding the history, but also how do we make sure that these families stick together? And we have seen time and time again that these police officers have broken our families and our systems.
Yeah. I'm trying to score. I see you, Angela. Angela put all those fire comments. I was talking about her over at DCFS. Yes, you are definitely a true champion over there fighting for our babies.
I do want to, you guys really covered everything already, but I just want to add something too here that's something around that I think I want to just make it more very clear, like really, really clear. I think we really begin to overcomplicate and conceptualize ideas about the reality of what's happening with child welfare, of the reality of what's happening and the focus of human rights. And we've seen that in history as well, right? The dehumanization of Black and brown people. So it's really coming back to that. I feel like we overcomplicate the simplicity of our own humanness. Like coming back into our community without the destruction and the biases of what it means to be human. And for so long, it's really been a almost gatekeeping of what that looks like. What does it look like to be human? What does it feel like to be human, and how humanness should be expressed? So as far as practicality, it really looks like having a clear shared mission and organizing large groups wherever you are, a social worker, foster parent, CEO of an amazing organization, all these different ways, really finding ways you can organize in groups and not like letting your ego get in the way of making a difference, with other people. That's something that I've seen pervasive as well. So one, focusing on prevention, but also the alleviation of child welfare in general, through the allocation of wealth to community solutions and partnerships that are economically sustainable for all of us. So that way we don't have to worry about getting fired and all these other different things. That funding is coming from the community. And if the community is saying this is what we want, then we should be investing into that. Because at the end of the day, we are run, in a capitalistic culture, embedded in several layers of the matrix. That's a whole other conversation for another time. But for many of us, that's what our reality is, and how we are able to even operate and find ways to be sustainable in our day-to-day lives.
I love that, Angela. Thank you so much. We only have 2 minutes, and I'm sorry we didn't get to the questions, but I want to end on this note. What would LA County look like? Our children and families and communities, what would it look like if we actually achieved our goals? Like, what would that look like?
Well, I might not have a job as a minors attorney anymore.
Okay.
And that would actually be a wonderful thing. I would love that, to work my way out of a job. Amen. I would love to be able to work and assist families. Really, my dream would be to preserve the family without having court involvement. And I know that's something that's like preservation, pre-preserving, I can't talk, pre-filing. How can we assist a family before it even gets there, right? Because once the petition is filed and it lands in my lap, the trauma has already happened, right? Even if the petition gets dismissed, the trauma has already happened. But I would love to see a system where there are issues, and I don't want to neglect the fact. I would be lying if I said there aren't kids that are out there that need, families out there that need assistance. There are kids that get raped and molested and then get beaten. And there are kids that are neglected because their parents aren't able to care for them because they have mental illness and real substance abuse issues. But these are not things that we need to penalize. These are families that we need to help. So ideally, it would be a system where we can keep kids with their families, where we can serve the family, whatever the needs are, to keep the child safe, but also to address whatever the abuse or trauma or issues or challenges that the parent and family are facing, that families would rely on community, extended family, and that we could really remedy that. We have so many organizations and wonderful nonprofits. I don't think we really need to reinvent the wheel. I think we rather need to make use of the resources we already have, and ideally get rid of the court system and keep kids safe in another way altogether. That's the system I would love to be a part of. I'd love to be an attorney helping families stay out of the system, not touched by court. How can I encourage and support families in that way? That to me would be ideal.
Mic drop, Heather, and right at the 1 o'clock mark. I agree with everything, and I think you said it all, and there is nothing left to add. I hope we all unemployed one day are working in support of our children and families.